Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man, a myth, a legend, a god, at least in his own mind,
Tim Longo. Yes, that's probably true. I am a legend in my own mind. No, not really. Yep, we're here to...
I was going to say, you live with people who take you down all the time, so I know you're not really a legend.
Yeah, no. I'm reminded often of that. So we're here to talk about Populous. One more episode. This will be our closing episode, and as we like to do, we try to have guests on to talk about the game that we just finished playing for the series, and somebody who's worked on the game, of course. And we were very fortunate through a mutual friend to have Glenn Corpes on today, and so I'm going to give him a quick intro, and then we'll jump right into it. So, welcome, Glenn.
Hello.
And so Glenn joined Bullfrog as chief graphics artist. He was co-designer and creator of Populous, and in 1991 he created Magic Carpet as well as the engine, which hopefully he'll give us a little bit of background of that as well. And then additionally took that engine to create the beginning of Dungeon Keeper. Glenn also worked on Syndicate and at Bullfrog as well as many others. In 1999, he left Bullfrog to create the studio Lost Toys, where he worked on games like Moho and Battle Engine Aquila and others. He then went on to work as a contractor and consultant at companies like Kuju, EA, and his next venture being a company called Weirdwood, which was focusing on online distributed games. He spent a little time at 22 Cans as a consultant there as well. And in 2001, Edge Magazine named him one of the most gifted game programmers in the industry. Since then, he's been working on various projects, especially some in the iOS space, like Topia, Fat Owl and the Jetpack, with the Jetpack and Ground Effect. And then he's also been dabbling in VR and AR space, including a cool game with his son called Powered Up. So welcome to the podcast, Glenn. We're very, very happy to have you on.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, it was fascinating to hear. I just got contacted to say these guys are talking about your about Populous, and it was just fascinating to hear several hours of people theorizing about what we were thinking, and just and I immediately started taking notes about where you were right or wrong. It's just a really interesting thing to hear. I'm very flattered that you spend so much time playing such an old game
That's our thing. That's kind of our thing. Yeah, I mean, we two developers trying to look back at the industry, over the years and seeing sort of where influences were coming from and genre creating games and things. And so one of the ways that we like to start, actually, if you don't mind, is it's kind of just hearing about how you got into games industry and your career, your early days of your career, and of course how you got into Bullfrog. So what was that? What were the early days of Glenn as a game developer like?
Well, I didn't see a computer until I was 16, nearly 17, which was in late 1980. Commodore PET was a Commodore PET in the school. So as I went back to the sixth form, which is kind of, I don't know what that's equivalent to in American terms, but I ended up sort of in the sixth form part of school, which is kind of the extra 2 years that you'd normally do before going to university. I just spent most of my time playing with the computers in the back of the physics lab. And also I had a ZX81 by 1981, the sort of tiny little Sinclair thing that was big in the UK back then, but I don't think got to the States much.
Yeah, and, no, it was not a big one for stateside.
And then I sort of arrogantly assumed that at 18 that I was going to be able to use my skills to get a job in programming. And even in 1982, I managed not to, and then ended up being a computer operator for 4 years, which is kind of interesting because I was working with seismic data processing on a Cray 1 and stuff like that. But I was just the guy mounting tapes and picking up printout. And then 4 years after that, I managed to get a job in programming, but it was sort of out of date stuff on CPM machines and for telex of all things, which was a dead technology even then. And then I got made redundant from that job. And there was a guy that I knew from a computer game shop in Guildford, a guy called Kevin, who used to walk around with an Amiga jacket on. And it turned out that he worked, and he would brag about this place he worked, Taurus. And eventually I nagged him into getting an interview. So when I was 23, I was interviewed by Peter Molyneux, who we just sat and chatted for about 2 hours about various things. And then he said, well, I haven't got any vacancies for programming anyway. And he said, can you draw? And I said, well, I can draw a bit. So he sort of broke out D-Paint, asked me to draw a piece of wood. And I literally played around with the smear tools to do they look like wood grain, and they gave me a job out of them. And I started. and I
wait,
was sort of
you did that on the fly in the interview? He asked you to do that?
Yeah, the interview went from being a programming interview to a art interview, when they said they didn't have any vacancies. So I sort of...
How funny.
So the first game I worked on was Druid 2 Enlightenment, which is a port of a sort of Gauntlet cloney thing on the Spectrum and Commodore 64 onto the Amiga. And the interesting thing about doing that was we did it without any reference to the original code. And Peter, those are great programmer. We had the editor, we had the level editor, and so we could get that side exactly right. But everything else was just really created as we thought it should be. And the interesting thing about that is even though I was the artist, I was the only one who'd really thought about things like how collision detection work and stuff like that, because Peter wasn't really that sort of programmer. He's a brilliant programmer, as I'll mention later, but we were very much sort of winging it and making it up as we went along. And we released that game, and then another game called Fusion that was sort of our own IP, but based on the tech, which was like horribly slow scrolling thing. And I'm pretty sure that between them, those two games bought in something like £17,000. It should have been about, I don't know, $25,000. And that was like a year and a half's work for 3 people. So we were kind of completely messed up at this point. And Peter went back to work on the database for the Amiga that Taurus had been doing before. And
the most amazing database or whatever it was. I mean, it was
it was I don't even really know what relational database means even now. So it's such an archaic term. And he went back to work on that. And I was thinking, well, they've not given me any work to do. I've got to do something. So I went and I bought my Atari ST in from home, because it was an Amiga studio, but I bought my Atari ST in from home, intending to try and convert one of the games we'd just done onto it, and then immediately ran into something which I suspected was going to happen. I found out that it just couldn't horizontally scroll well enough to do the job. So I then set about just doing something which I'd found interesting for a few years. I don't know how many of these were big in the States, but there were a lot of games, a lot of quite significant games on the Spectrum, and also in the C64 and stuff in the UK, that were isometric, and they were like Alienate and Night Law. And the game that really got me was a game called Spin Dizzy, which was sort of a Marble Madness clone. And it basically had a set of 16 blocks, which made these sloping, the various different slopes and corner slopes and stuff, exactly the blocks that you see in Populous. And so I wrote the code to sort of draw those on the screen, and then I was thinking, well, to do anything useful with this, I need to really write an editor for it, so that I've got like a level of them or whatever. But I didn't fancy investing the time in writing an editor, so instead I wrote a map generator, a thing that just, and if you imagine, it literally goes around the map, raising a point and selecting the correct combination of the blocks around it, and then it moves randomly to a new point, and then raises that, and then it moves to another one, and by the time it's raised one of them up to level 8, it stops and says that's a level. And that is basically the landscape generator that's in Populous.
Wow.
This was all written, this stuff, by the way, was written over a 3-day long weekend where I had nothing better to do than go into the office. I went into the office because my computer was there, because I'd already taken it in there to try and do this port thing. And I literally playing around with these isometric blocks. And then I had it sort of generating like a landscape of them. But it didn't look anything like a landscape because it was all intersecting pyramids, as you know, because you know what Populous looks like. So I was thinking, how do I make this look more like a landscape? I need to be able to flatten some of these things out. So I put raising and lowering land on a joystick that you could move around in the central point of the bit you were scrolling to. You could hold the button down and then move the joystick up because there's only one button on an ST joystick, and so it had raise and lower land. And also in those first 3 days of work, when I didn't know why I was doing this, what I was doing it for, it was completely speculative. I was trying to recreate Spin Dizzy or something. I had the map in the corner of the screen, and one of the things about that map where you kept saying, they're only pixels. The problem with that map is that it's literally 64 by, if you imagine a 64 by 64 pixel square, that's the size of the map. So originally, on the very first version of the map was a square in the corner. But if you then imagine shearing that square twice, so it's still the same number of pixels. That's the diamond-shaped map that you see. It's just the maths that translates it into that space. Fills the space perfectly, and every single one of the pixels in that map is just a lookup equivalent of one of the blocks in the main screen. So that is literally a view of the whole world rendered badly with only a pixel per cell. That's what the map is.
Right.
And I had all that stuff working in 3 days, and I think I might have even started drawing the book for some reason. That was in very early, maybe not quite that early.
Oh, really? That was one question we had, is sort of like the way, the style of the interface and stuff.
Well, yeah, definitely the graphics for the all grass blocks were drawn in that time, and they were never updated. And the graphics for the animating sea were drawn in that time. The graphics for the coastline weren't. And most of the backdrop graphics, and I had no idea what we were going to do with it. It was complete. It was like Monday was what we call in the UK a bank holiday. It was a 3-day weekend, and so work started on Tuesday, and I showed it to everybody else, and they were like, "Ooh, that's amazing. What we're going to do with it." And then the next thing, it was a very simple port to get it onto the Amiga. Now I can't really remember the specifics of how we handled the cross-platform aspects of this, but it was to do with the stuff we'd done on the previous games. I think a lot of it was like pure assembler, but some of it was C, and a lot of it was was pretty simply portable. And we used to sort of transfer. Yeah, we hadn't really used the ST at this point. I'm fuzzy about how we managed to get it done so simply. But by the time it was running on the Amiga, which Peter basically locked himself in a room and started playing around with it. And the game the game on the top is all his, but the original prototype, it's all just from a code aspect,
right?
From a design aspect,
was from that. Yep.
There's
so Populous originally was played on the joystick, is what you're saying?
Yes, and in fact, the first thing Peter did for it, which is the very first thing he suggested, he said this has to work on a mouse. And my reaction was like, "Oh my God, I've got to sort of work backwards from a mouse position to where that is in the map," which ended up having to sort of work out roughly which diagonal scan through the map it was, based on the X coordinate, and then basically transform all the Y coordinates and work out which one was the closest fit, and that's the one I clicked on. And I can remember being. That kind of, I don't want to write this. The joystick's good, and he was insistent. So there you go. So that right from there, that was important. That was very important, because if it had been on joystick, it just wouldn't have been the same. It wouldn't have been anything like the same game. But
it feels very much like a mouse game. Yeah, I mean, at that point. But of course, once you guys decided to do that, of course, it would be designed around that. I mean, it could have gone the other way too, but I get it. Wow. So luckily you had that experience of creating wood art, because you immediately went into making grass art, and so you're saying that artwork for the tiles didn't change since you did that initial prototype?
The initial 3D. Somewhere I've got an Atari ST disc that if it still loads, has got a 3-day demo on it, and I wonder.
No,
I need to get it to somebody with a working floppy drive that can read a slightly strangely formatted ST disk. Because I've started this process and then lost touch or got
that has to go into a museum. Yeah. What are you kidding? You can't just have that in your house anymore. We gotta get that anyway. So that'll be a side project. How do we get that disc into a museum?
Well, like I say, it's Atari ST format, so which is like a PC format that people would hack to have extra tracks and sectors, so that the format would get bigger and stuff. So they're very flaky at loading, but one day I'll give it a try.
So cool, so cool. We have so many stories over the course of the podcast where people, like the whole concept of somebody going in on a long weekend and coming out of that weekend with some sort of solution or prototype or something that there's so many
Diablo
stories
came out of that, with
Diablo. Yeah. It's so cool to hear that sort of the genesis of that was in that way. Wow.
But there's a few things that you guys said about the how you thought it worked, which I can talk about with just a little bit I'm talking about now, which is interesting. One thing you were talking about a lot was how much the screen real estate is wasted. Now that's a fair comment, but if you think about it, the hexagon shape that the land can fill is the entire height of the screen and 256 pixels out of 320 wide. So it's 4/5 of the screen wide and the entire height where it can potentially go according to the vertical undulations. Now, the whole idea of having that sort of section in there is a stupid one, and it does cause wasted space. But the pipework stuff and the book are both areas that can, well, half of the book are areas that can be covered over by the landscape when the level rises. So I saw them as sort of spare space,
Yeah, that's interesting because I think that the strategies we used tended to be more flat and low.
Yeah, exactly. They're always exactly. It's not. It doesn't justify it. I'm just saying
it makes sense when you tell me that. I'm like, oh yeah, of course, yeah.
And the other thing that you said is you suggested that it was using a partial update and only updating the bit that changes. It absolutely is not doing that. It's brute forcing the whole thing. It's literally clearing the screen with the background screen, which has the map rendered into it, just copying it straight across. And on the Amiga, it would use the blitter. But the ST is about 10%. The ST is about 10% faster than an Amiga if you don't use the blitter at all. And the game hardly uses the blitter, but it uses it for the screen copy and a few other, and also it doesn't lose any CPU for playing samples. So the Amiga version sort of balances out to be about the same speed as the ST one, but it was a really underutilized in the Amiga game. It doesn't use the blitter for any of the graphics or anything. It just does it with the CPU like you do on an ST.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, I knew the Amiga had a blitter because I remember that being a distinguishing factor, now, especially now that you say it. I'm like, yeah, that was a thing.
And another thing that you said is you said that you thought it was 256 colors. It's 16 colors. And I stole the palette from a game called Dungeon Master on the ST, which was Dungeon Master was a big game on the ST, and it was quite big on the Amiga. And by the time it got to the PC, it was so late that it was... it was like 92 or 93. So people would have, it probably came out. Yeah, it came out definitely after Underworld. So the idea that
it was too late at that point. I remember being super jealous.
But on the
Amiga,
on the ST. I mean, it was the only time I ever knew Peter Molyneux to touch an ST was to play Dungeon Master. And because I'm the only person that ever touched an ST for Bullfrog. I did all 4 of their ST ports, before we ditched support of the ST altogether. But
so at that time, how many people were there when you're showing? You said you come out of the weekend with the prototype, and you're showing folks. Like what's the number of people that you're talking about there?
There's about 4, maybe 5 people. There was a guy who was like a tester there was a guy who was the musician who worked on the games, who also was a salesman for the who worked, his main job was a salesman for the business software, but he also was a musician. He did the audio, and his roommate was a guy called Andrew Bailey, who was actually the original. He had written Druid 2, which was the first game we did the port of, and when he was 14, along with a friend of his called Dean Carter, who was also 14. And Dean Carter later went on to join Bullfrog and became and then left Bullfrog to form Big Blue Box, and was one of the directors of the company that made Fable before it folded back into Lionhead later. So we ended up knowing Dean, but our first game was a port of this game by these two 14-year-old kids. And
How funny.
And the only reason we got the contract is that was before my time, but the only reason as I started, the only reason that contract happened is because the guy who wrote the original game was the roommate of our salesman. So it was, and they went on
the old days. Yeah.
And he went on to write the sound. He wrote the sound system that we use for all of our Amiga stuff. Andrew Bailey did, because we weren't really that low level at the time. I was sort of low level on the ST, and Kevin, the other programmer, became low level on the Amiga. And but Peter was very much he was the kind of person. He didn't. The idea that the screen was the screen pixels were memory, just it didn't compute. It wasn't the kind of it never occurred to him. But he knew C properly, and he could operate at a much higher level than any game programmer I knew at the time. But he wasn't somebody who understood the metal bashing element, which I think was cool because Populous was written in C as well, mostly, apart from the graphics routines, and that was kind of unheard of in the UK game dev at the time. And in fact, we switched to pure assembler for Populous 2 and Powermonger, which was probably pointless, given the sort of 90-10 rule of where it's worth optimizing and stuff. But sorry, I'm going way off.
No. These are great. I mean, we love kind of getting the backstory of this stuff. I mean, we kind of can go wherever the conversation takes us. So to talk about some of the other aspects. So you have this prototype, this rendering, and you said Peter kind of spent time looking at it and thinking about the sort of, I guess, how the rest of the design or some of the other design aspects kind of
he just
bolt onto that.
He just
okay.
Yeah.
So when you say that, are you talking about what other aspects of beyond your prototype were the next sort of steps? Was it the AI or the mana bar or things like that?
But he went off into the doing his thing, and he would just occasionally would ask for things like, we need some buildings, we need some people.
Got it.
So I because I drew all those graphics. I mean, we did the whole thing in 7 months from start to finish between the two of us.
Wow.
And I think if there's more than about 3 man weeks of graphics in the entire game, I'd be amazed. It's like it's something I did in the gaps in between, in between programming. It was a bit of light relief, So I can remember drawing all the houses, and they were just sort of like they were just the first things that I could draw. But there was no design done for it. I mean, the fact that there's sort of steampunk elements and there's this weird book and thing, I don't know where any of it came from, really. It was just,
right. It just happened.
So what would happen is he took the Populous has got the landscape's made out of blocks rather than sprites. The difference between a block and a sprite being that the blocks don't get shifted, so they're much quicker to draw. And the buildings are blocks as well. The sprites that only ever get drawn on a 16-pixel boundary, and the people are actual sprites. So there was a time when the people sprites didn't exist. They were just the blocks. So there were buildings, and there were so they would literally move from square to square like a board game, and that was the level. That was sort of where Peter was writing the playable version of the game. And the thing about Populous that's not entirely clear and comes out of this time is that there are only 256 units in the world, in the entire sort of people or building related units in the entire world, and there's no linked lists off of any of these things, and they literally, and there can only be one thing on every square. So what happens is, it can be either a building or a person of either type, but it could also be a building with somebody leaving, or 2 people fighting, or 2 people joining. Those are all different states that but the things move about like tiles, and the animation of them moving from one square to the other is all illusory, really. But they do move at independent times, like a it's not like they don't all move at once or anything, but they're not proper units moving around a map. They're things moving from one cell to the one next to it, and with special cases for like, there's two people joining on this one, so when we draw this one, we'll draw two guys fighting, or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? And there's no linked list or anything. There's no pathfinding. I mean, some of this is one of this. I did watch Peter's talk, because he did there was a lot of rubbish in it, but something that he reminded me of something, because I watched it quite recently in the GDC post-mortem. There's the way that the navigation works. So you've got a map. There are all these 64 by 64 maps. One of them's how high this cell is off the ground. One of them's which graphic it is. One of them's how high this is sort of when viewed as a vertex height. And then there's also a map called Map Who, which one of the 256 things is on this square. And then there's one called Map Steps, which gets incremented every time anybody walks across it. So the sort of primitive pathfinding algorithm would avoid areas with high map steps, and that would give them the ability to sort of, after wandering around, they would suddenly take the right route eventually, because they'd filled in all the wrong ones, and with their we had no idea how to do like an A star or any of that.
That's amazing.
And
it's like anti-pheromones. It's like the opposite of an ant colony.
It's exactly. It's almost it's flipping it would have been more sensible,
That's amazing.
But yeah, there's literally 256 units in the world, and this is the thing that Peter was working on, was this sort of like board game thing, where there was no illusion of people walking from place to place, but that was the space that he was designing the game in. So he came up with the idea that, and you sort of got towards this. But each one of the buildings needs basically each building looks at the 5x5 grid of cells that it's in, and it counts them. And according to what the number is, it can be one of the buildings, and by the time it gets to, you've got all 5x5, it can be a castle, which coincidentally happens to be flat enough to draw the castle on. It's just luck, but
right.
The castle isn't really bigger than the others. It just has something drawn on its flat space, and we know about its flat space. But normally the building style is based on that. And there's a really huge thing which I think you sort of understood, and it's very fundamental to Populous, is that the people aren't people; they're groups of people with a population.
Okay.
So all they have is and the thing in the corner, which you might have noticed,
and that's where the shield comes in, right? Because that tells you.
I'm going to explain to you what the bars mean.
Yeah, you gotta get into the bars. You gotta get into the bars.
But every fight is so every battle, for example, is taken as like, it just looks at the two numbers on each side, works out what it's going to be, and plays an animation of the people fighting, and it goes down to gets the winner is the one with the most people. But they've also got like a weapons multiplier, which starts off as a fist and then goes up through club to bow and arrow, and then ends up with sword or something. I can't remember exactly how many of them there are.
Yep.
And that's the multiplier on the number of people. And the way you get that weapons factor is that the castle has the sword, and all the others have smaller numbers on the green landscape at least. So the weapons multiplier for a group of people will be whatever the highest weapons multiplier that contributed to that group was. And then,
so it's coming from the building. So let me follow that. So you're saying that. Well, how does the weapon multiplier increase?
Sounds like
over time?
a person leaves the building, so they have the weapon and they join with other people to make more people. That's that gather mechanic I mentioned, right?
Yeah.
And so if they gather up, it sounds like whoever has the best weapon becomes the weapon the whole group has.
Yeah. So and that just becomes a multiplier for the population on the calculation of the fight. I don't know. I don't even know if there's a random element in it. There may or may not be, But so that's what the thing in the top right hand corner, which you didn't mention, was. But the two bars, right now, population can get quite big of one of those people. Now, if you imagine that you had a 4-digit number, right? Yeah, and
I can't imagine it. No,
imagine a normal 4-digit number representing the population. Now imagine that the last 2 digits are in orange, and the hundreds digit is in yellow. and the thousands digit is in red. Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, you're just seeing two of the bars. So when the population's small, you see the bottom two digits, and then as the third digit gets one in it, you get like a little yellow bar. I think you get a little yellow bar and an orange one. So that means you're now looking at the hundreds and the tens. And then as it gets even bigger, which you might do, sort of in Armageddon bits, the fourth one kicks in and it's red, and then you get red and yellow. So they're digits. They're just you can see two digits of the number, and of course the number is not decimal; it's hexadecimal, and the bars are 16 high. So you can basically you're viewing the two most significant digits of the 16-bit number that represents the population of that person, color keyed to tell you what number you're looking at.
So you do, in fact, have perfect information in the game.
I mean, why we thought this was a good way of doing it rather than just putting a number.
I'm sitting here like, whoa, that's amazing.
So it's just, but you're right though. In different contexts, so if it's a fight, it will show the relative things. If it's a building, it will show.
That's the trick, is that it's contextual. Yeah, that's where it kind of broke my brain a little bit. Yeah.
So I think when it's a building, it shows the population in some absolute sense on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is saying how full that is. And each building has got a population capacity. So the only way, so as you noticed and pointed out, if you make a flat land, somebody goes into the castle, and it takes ages to fill up to the point where they're going to be kicked out because population capacity is enormous. So what you do is you have to sort of lower it intentionally so that somebody gets forced to pop out. So typically the way to play it, I would play it, is that you'd end up building when you've got about 4 castles, you'd then go around the edge making more flat land, and then you just go through lowering the occasional point, and the castles would all split up, turn into sort of various smaller houses and things, but there would be loads of spare people around, and then you flatten the things out so the castles came back, and there would be a few quite big walkers walking around who'd then settle, and then you'd be so that the whole trick was to lower and then raise to do it.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I don't, because there's no video to this. The other trick, which I'm sure you would have come up with, the best way of building flat land from the sea is to go 2 left clicks and then a right click. So you get a double height pyramid, and then it flatten the top off it, and you can fill. So that quickly becomes the way that you end up playing. But you're right.
I think I was approaching. I think I was approaching that.
I was doing it accidentally at times and going, "Oh, that's cool," and then it didn't register as a strategy for doing it quickly because I didn't. The other thing too is like how I didn't understand how much all of that cost. So I think I was more cost conscious of like how much mana was this costing me to do these things, right?
Funnily enough, some of these things are much clearer on the SNES. Like on the SNES, there's actually a button which, one of the buttons will lower a point and then raise it later, and it becomes a feature, and there's in the tutorial it might or at least in the manual it might mention that you can, the 2 up 1 down thing. It's funny because it was a good year or so later. It was almost a SNES launch title, but it's not one that anyone remembers. I mean, when the SNES first came out, I got a Japanese import with 6 games. And one of them was Populous, and that was pretty much all that was all that was available at the time. For the Japanese Super Nintendo before they were released here. So
how funny, that's crazy that it was a.
I don't think it was quite a launch title, but it was
early,
sort of very early enough that there wasn't a very big list.
We didn't have time to play. We definitely, as you probably heard us, we were kind of speculating about the SNES version. We didn't have time to play it, but I am fascinated.
No, I wouldn't recommend
the
playing
interface. Was it essentially using the D-pad to move around, and
yes,
then that's how you move from point to point? Yeah, that's rough. Yeah,
but it used all the buttons. But like I said, it used all the other buttons to do weird things like I said, forcing the castles to eject people and stuff. It was actually very playable, and it was one of them. It was a very significant platform for the success of the game, to be honest. Because
I'm sure
one of the things that you said it sold 1 million in the first year, which I find is incredible if true, because
that's the data I could get on the internet.
Yeah, well, it was only on the it was only on the ST and Amiga for the first year, and the ST and Amiga, were not many. Were games selling millions on that? Maybe they were. Yeah, presumably they were. I know that in the UK chart, because we used to get the industry trade paper that went out to all the game shops. It used to come to our office, and it was number one in that for 7 weeks. So because we had them all plastered over the office wall.
Yeah,
which was a pretty good run. Which is a pretty good run for the UK chart, but I don't.
It is. That's a good run for today. Even I mean, 7 weeks. Jeez.
I'm not 100% sure would have got to 1 million.
Maybe the stat was beyond the year or something, or including the SNES or something. Yeah, but I mean, maybe. It's. I mean, it's. Yeah, you can't argue that it was a success though, and yeah. So okay, so then so I get the bars more than now too. It's just such a crazy way to. So you're saying on the SNES there actually was a button that was devoted to ejecting walkers from the buildings? Yeah. Is that what you just said? Oh,
yeah. And
interesting.
It didn't do it by just sort of ejecting walkers. It did it by lowering the land on the corner of the building, and then that would do the ejection for you, and then putting it back.
Yeah. Oh, so it was automated in. Yeah. So we happened into that strategy ourselves that you were just explaining. To get them to leave the castles, but we didn't know why, essentially. So now we know why, because the castle capacity was so high. Wow. Okay, holy cow. Yeah, so there's just a lot going on. So we also talked about a little bit about sort of, Brett had a good point in his takeaway from last episode of just emergent strategies. Were there any? I mean, you just mentioned the sort of 2 up, 1 down, which I think I was heading towards something like that, realization that was the most efficient way. We just didn't play, we didn't play. I think I got to level, late 30s or early 40s as far as levels go. So I'm sure if I would have kept playing, that would have emerged. But are there other ones that, other than that one and the sort of destroy your castle to create more, others that you guys kind of happened upon after playing over the whole time? And if there weren't any, that's fine. But
emergent game, I don't know. But the thing about it's sort of a. I can't think of anything offhand. Maybe something will come up later.
Yeah, sure. No, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but yeah.
But I mean, one of the things that was kind of different about Populous is the thing was multiplayer only until about a month before the end.
Oh my God, that's what I was just going to ask you. I want to talk about multiplayer because we didn't play it.
We had well, I think you can play the PC version. That's a funny thing, actually.
Oh yeah.
The ST and Amiga versions could talk to each other, and obviously across a null modem cable, which we had in the office, which we were using for transferring files and for playing Stunt Car Racer on, because that also worked on the same cable. We just supported that, and it uses a very simple lock-stepped mechanic where both players make their moves, they swap them, and then both players play their moves, and it's kept in sync by determinism, which is a bit risky, but it means that they only had to sort of exchange about 5 bytes per frame. The downside of that is that the maximum frame rate is the ping, which means it's not very playable. It's kind of playable on a network, and the PC version is totally playable on networks. Even the last time I tried it was a while ago, but it worked. And the way it works is, I told Peter an anecdote about when I was working as a computer operator. This go back into the ancient history there. The guy that I used to work with, who was an operator, who was learning to program, and he wanted to write a multiplayer chess game that worked on 2 terminals. And he spoke to all the programmers, and they all said to him, "You can't do that. There's no way of a terminal talking to another terminal on this 1980 mainframe sort of thing." And he went away and decided that he was going to make them communicate through a shared file. They just basically open the file, read it, close it, write to it, close it, and the other player, they just literally do that, just keep opening and closing the same network shared file. I told Peter this anecdote when we were doing Populous, and the multiplayer game works like that. If you map a drive called T to if DOSBox allows it, if you can map a network drive called T : then it will just save a file called t:/pop.dat, and both the machines will look at it. And the last time I tried that, which was maybe 20 years ago, it still worked. But
I imagine it still does. Then,
if DOSBox allows network map to network drives, then you might better make it work now. I'm not making any claims for it.
Holy cow! What a great anecdote to hear about sort of like how that story came to be. So the game you guys developed it as it's via multiplayer, which does make some sense, I guess, but we don't think of it that way immediately.
No, and the single player game. Basically, what we'd do is we would spend all day working on it, programming, and then we'd sort of stop at about 6:30 in the evening and play it for about 3 hours, and then go down the pub for a few hours and talk about it, and then go back in there and talk about what we'd learned. And so the game is the single player game is actually written to fight me. That is the I was. Peter's experience of playing the game was pretty much only against me, and mine against him. Because it was all done in 7 months flat, like I say. So there wasn't really any time for testing and stuff. And so we were a couple of months out, and the only mode we had in the game that was single player. We had this computer opponent, but there's a mode in it called custom game, which is still in the final game, where you go into it. And you can select the skill level of the computer, which is basically a delay on how often it thinks, and some other more vaguer concept that you'd have to ask Peter about. And also the flags for he can use swamps, you can use castles and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And something else you can do with that. So that custom game is the only thing that you could play. There was no campaign or anything.
Right.
So there was multiplayer and that custom game. And finally, and one thing about the custom game that I'll point out is somebody mentioned on one of the podcasts about getting the game to play itself. You can do that in there. You can say computer versus computer, and it's quite interesting on a PC to let it run flat out. So it runs at about 60 frames a second, and you watch two computer opponents building flat land, and then you pause it and you try and tweak the settings to try and make it so that the losing player can get back. So that's an emergent gameplay. But I think I might be the only person that ever played this. And I was playing this on like Windows 95, 98 maybe. Something like that. I was playing that on Windows 98. So years later. But I don't know if anyone's ever really played that. It's quite a good little. It's quite a fun little way of.
Well, it's such an automated. I mean, we talked a lot about sort of passive control and or indirect control, and it would be, now that you mention it, it would be a game that would lend itself quite well to computer versus computer, because of the way the AI works, and I mean, it was just even fascinating to watch as you're playing the campaign, to watch the enemy AI do what it's doing, and how it's sort of rubber banding and reacting to what you're doing as a player. Difficulty was definitely a question that we had sort of. Which maybe is more of a Peter question or something, but how, because when you start each level, it kind of gives you all the parameters for that level, which sort of
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of them's literally how often does it think? Once the fastest speed it thinks every game turn, the slowest speed it thinks every 20th or something, and the other one is more about the concept of aggression in the other AI, which I can talk about how the other AI works, but like I said, this is where my knowledge is a little bit fuzzy of this, because Peter wrote all this stuff separately, and then something really weird happened, is that he had a hard disk crash and had to rewrite most of the AI. And during that time during the time we were doing this, I had also ported Fusion to the ST eventually, and I was getting that through QA. So there was a period of about 2 weeks where Peter was re-implementing everything that he'd lost, and I was sitting with my feet up on the desk and sort of telling him when he had to type and stuff, which really was saving time because it meant he didn't hit build, So I'm quite well versed with how it worked, even though I didn't actually write it. So. And because we were bouncing ideas off each other, and it was a re-implementation. I mean, we'd be working on it now if he hadn't had the hard disk crash. The way these things. So I kind of know what the strategy. I know what the strategy it uses. I just don't quite know exactly how that aggression multipliers work. Like, for example, it's all to do with how when it decides it's not going to spend mana on this effect, it's going to save up for another one. I'm completely unclear on the mechanism it uses for that. Sorry about this coughing. It's not COVID, I promise.
We're too far away to catch it, so have at.
But no worries.
Like when it does a volcano or a swamp or anything, it always does it on your oldest building. So you can use that to your advantage, like because you could know that this tent over here has been there since the beginning, and you're going to leave it there because that way, the first time it can afford volcano, it's going to just blast that rather than your biggest castle. And
wow.
Sorry.
Yeah, so you can wall off some area of the map and be like, okay, well, when you're ready to kill something, come kill this, Yeah,
it's all very predictable. It's all very predictable, and the only way that it really gets to win is by sheer speed. Like when you do a flood, the computer player does what you could do and raise the people back out of the water. But it prioritizes that over everything else, and it will literally raise one every frame according to what speed it's allowed to raise them out of the water at. So it's very hard to beat it on saving people from the flood.
Yes, no, I mean, watching that happen in real time is fascinating and terrifying because because I think we both use the flood strategy quite a bit, and you flood and then you watch their side of the map, and it's just maddening how quickly that they basically, like, essentially, if you do it right, essentially you've entirely wiped them out, but then immediately these little islands just start popping up. So, and it's interesting. You just said something there really quick I want to pull on, is that you said that really the main way that they win is through speed, which is, I guess for some reason to me interesting, because I guess that it does make sense. But it's not like through some sort of other sort of strategic AI or something. It's really just how fast can they get there, kind of thing. Which would, of course, I guess creates. Do you know, or do you remember? Do they have the same sort of mana rules that you have as a player, or is there some sort of cheating or rubber banding going on there?
I have exactly the same mana rules. There's a subtle rule with the mana which is that if you have any mana at all, or enough mana to raise a point, you can raise it. But if that raise is like raising a lot of other points, because the raised point is recursive, obviously sometimes when you raise a point, it raises a load of others. The amount it actually costs is proportional to the amount of points you raise. So raising a 7 high pyramid to an 8 high pyramid is equivalent to raising something like 256 points. So it costs 256 times more than raising a point from the seabed, and you can go into debt with that. So if ever you saw the mana bar fly off the left of the scale, it was because you'd done a raise, done a landscape modification that put you into debt. So you have to be quite careful at the beginning. Right at the beginning, you don't want to use the 2 up 1 down trick because you can't afford it. No, at the very beginning, you're going to be going individual clicks to try and because mana's scarce and
interesting. Okay, so and then do you have to pay that debt back or
yes,
is it literal debt?
Well, it just has to go back up to 0 again. It just means you won't be able to raise the point for a few seconds, and sometimes, when you really start to lose, there are things that can cost you mana. Like I think when a building gets destroyed, you actually lose some, and also the amount of mana you get is I'm not sure if it's multiplied by the weapons factor, but it's multiplied by something like the weapons factor of the building. So you get some mana per person, multiplied by the way they're living, or something like that. So
if you want to power level mana, then you want to kind of power up those units or something to get more mana each round or what have you.
The night went in very late because it's very hard to finish the game, and the Armageddon is obviously one way of doing it. You press that button and it's like you get that far.
Yeah, I did it once.
And someone's going to win. So it's a very, very brute force, coarse way of forcing making the game so it doesn't go on forever. But the night is also designed to do that. It's like you say, you just basically invest a load of your people into this knight, and hopefully with a high weapons factor, and send him out to do his thing and give him a hand. And that's the other thing that the computer player has. So you did talk about this one a bit. The computer player does another way that it cheats is he gets messages back from the knight saying, I can't get where I want to go, and will then raise points for him, which you don't get. You'd have to go and look at it.
Yeah.
So that's.
I didn't follow my knights so meticulously to even notice that. I just assumed that they were.
No, I noticed that they wouldn't be able to path, right, and that you had to make basically a pipeline for them. If they got to a little disconnected part of the map where they couldn't go directly towards a goal, like on a canonical direction, I guess, they would just get stuck, right? They'd be in, the trough there.
And the computer opponent's solution to that is to cheat, because he gets a message saying stuck knight, and he'll spend his next turn raising the land there, and the knight will walk to it. So you'll sort of see those sort of tendrils of land coming across if he as far as knighting.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I would use the focus on knight button to pop around on the knights, to see what they were doing, but I wouldn't really, I think, analyze if they were able to path where I wanted them to. So that's interesting.
It was your job to make it good. So. Yeah.
To go back to the being in a multiplayer mode for a lot of the development. So is that basically where the campaign came from when it comes to the seeds and the 500 levels and sort of how, I mean, you guys basically got to a point where you're like, okay, we obviously have the core gameplay and the engine running, and it's awesome and fun. How do we make a campaign now? Because it's such an odd approach to that,
We were 2 weeks from the end, right? And the guy who was the producer at Electronic Arts was a guy called Josh Ellis, who I don't even know if he's still in the industry. Probably not. Who knows? But he had previously been a producer for a company called Firebird, and they had a game called The Sentinel. Do you know The Sentinel? It's very much it's out on the C64. It's a very
ringing
strange
a bell, but it's not coming to me.
It's a strange game where you rotate on the spot and absorb this 3D thing, and it's got very nice 3D graphics, but it uses the trick that you only rotate on the spot, and it uses like a cylindrical projection. It's an interesting game in itself, but it's got that's all that's irrelevant. But what's relevant about it is just levels are fractally generated, and it has 10,000 of them. And each time you pass one, you finish with a certain number of points, usually somewhere between 1 and 20 points of the game's energy, and that's how many levels you skip. So we basically, because we had the same producer at Electronic Arts who had been the producer on that game, me and him were just having a chat and goes, why don't we just rip off Sentinel and just make a thing? And that the campaign game is literally a text file with a bunch of each line that says has got flags to say what he can do, what you can do, what the speed should be, what the aggression should be. And there's not even one for every one of the 500 levels. There's one for every one of each group of 5 levels. And there's a seed for it, and then the other seeds are all that seed plus 1. So there's literally a text file with 100 lines in it. And that's the entire definition of the campaign. And the way that you traverse through it is you skip through it, on average, sort of, I don't know how the number's calculated from the score, but you tend to skip sort of 4 or 5, so you might sometimes, occasionally you'd see 2 in the same set, and then or sometimes you might skip the whole set, but it's sort of, the steps aren't allowed to get huge or anything, but that's how and that was all hacked together very quickly. And then for the second, there was actually a data disc for Populous called The Promised Lands, which has got sort of stupid themed, there's a Lego version level, unlicensed, fingers crossed job, and there's a sort of one where all the different houses are different computers, like there's a Spectrum and a Commodore 64, and the landscape looks like green and white printer paper, and they're just a stupid set of extra levels, and that was, me and some very junior guys who'd started wrote that did all the graphics for that in a week or so, in a couple of weeks while Peter was on holiday. And when he got back, he just knocked up another one of these text files in about an hour and then stuck it on it, and that was shipped, and that became the data disk. It was
yeah,
just
holy cow.
It was just new graphics, because each level's got slightly different tunings for how quickly the people die, and the different levels of people production on each different building and stuff like that. Although they don't get very exciting. I used to like it when you'd have like one of the smaller buildings might be the one that had the highest weapons factor, so you'd have to make sure you had plenty of those, but the computer opponent had trouble playing on those levels, so they went. But then the data disk had some sort of, but did have some more stupidly tuned ones, but
right, just for some variety. Yeah. So the landscape itself was procedural, you're saying, based on the seeds. There wasn't necessarily I'm looking at Sentinel now, actually. I do recognize some of the screenshots of it, but I never played it. Yeah. What a wild, and the cover, I recognize the cover too, of the video. But interesting.
Just the level progression thing was stolen for that, and it's for its ease of implementation, really.
Sure.
And
2 weeks, holy cow!
Yeah, it was literally 2 weeks out from the end of the game. 2 weeks after the end of the game, all you could do is play it multiplayer, which really needed a null modem cable, or people living next door to each other on a modem, maybe, if you were, and the custom game, which, where you can just fiddle with it and set up what you want the game to be. I mean, it was the whole thing. The whole playability of it, the fact that anyone ever went back to play it, hinged on that level progression system being like it was, kind of. It seemed to do the job. But it was very touch and go when you think it wasn't there 2 weeks out.
How crazy! Because with 2 weeks till ship, there's no time to test, really. So you're just kind of hoping for the best on that. Did anyone finish the game before it shipped? Finish meaning play all the way through the 500.
I think so. There was a guy called Neil who was an accountant at EA or something. He was a marketing person of some kind or something. He wasn't in development. And what EA used to do when they were a small company, and they only had a few, they didn't really have developers in their office. They were there was about 40 or 50 people in
publishers, basically,
in Slough, which is the town that the original UK version of The Office was set. And they were, that's where our producer worked and stuff. And they basically, everybody there was playing it. They had a few testers and stuff there, but the guy who QA'd it was a marketing guy who was picked to be not allowed to see it until the end. And he had to spend an entire week doing the QA, and that's how they used to do it back. They used to just bring anyone in, various people at the office would have to do QA duty, and it was this guy Neil, and he was the guy that tested it for a week, and he probably finished it in that week, because me and Peter finished it in about. Me and Peter both played it from the start when it was shipped, and we got to the end in about a week as well. So, but we obviously knew what we were doing too much. Yeah, if you're interested, I can tell you the most challenging level and how to beat it. It's about level 350, and I can remember the name. It's called Biloord, Billoord, and I think it's level 350, and it's a level. It's a rocky level where the only things that either of you can do are swamp and Armageddon, and the only way I can beat it. Right, is to build as much as you can, and then when you have to get the feel of when he's saved up enough to do an Armageddon, the other player, the computer player, and then what you have to do is swamp the hell out of the area, his side of the center of the map, so that when the Armageddon comes across and all the people come across, they will fall in the swamps, because you will not beat his ability to build enough people. All you can do is, that's the only way I could beat it. Now, Peter claimed to have beat it through a more normal technique of just outbuilding it, but I never saw him do it. But I beat it that way, when the game was shipped. But that's Billoord is a ridiculous level. But although he's saying that the levels are all very, very similar, to call it a ridiculous level sort of seems strangely arrogant. I remembered the name of it for all these years. So
of course, that's an infamous level. Yeah, now we have it in the time capsule of the podcast that everyone can go off and try it out.
I'll put it in the show notes so people can search for it later. I'll just put hardest, Biloord, the hardest level in Populous, and it'll be enshrined.
That's awesome. So do you have any? One of the things that we like to do as we're coming up on our hours is, and I think you've probably shared many of these as we've been talking, but one of the things that we do at the end of the series for the game is to kind of talk about some of our takeaways, or like what we would predict the pillars, not that you obviously necessarily had or needed pillars at this, at this era of game development, but what your big takeaways were for the game. And then also kind of like the other way to think about that is what are some of the things from Populous that you still carry with you today as a game developer? Is there anything that comes to mind that still influences you in your work from this game?
Well, I'd love to do another game that was like it, for me, I think I took slightly different things from it to what Peter did, and one of the things that I really miss about the original Populous, and I really don't know how broad this appeal is, but I'd like to find out, is that Populous was almost an arcade game. You kind of said it at one point that it was that the games are short and simple and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Every single thing that Peter's ever done with it has made it slower and bigger. Like Populous 2, the levels. Populous 1, the levels take 5 to 15 minutes, I would say. You've played it, so you'd know better than me.
Yeah,
They're pretty
less
quick.
than 15
They're pretty quick.
Yeah.
Populous 2, they take about half an hour. Populous at the beginning, much longer, but that doesn't really count. But you should really be looking at black and white.
Yeah, it's a whole different thing.
Black and white. When I played black and white, I stopped playing after about 4 hours when I'd got to the second level, and Goddess, you never really get off the first level on the first release of that, although that did change after they released it. So I just think all these things have been going in the wrong direction. And what I would love to do sometime is work on a game which is a snappy arcade version of, where it's back to the simplistically build here, ding, ding, it would almost feel. It would just be Populous taken off in the direction that I'd
totally agree. I totally agree with you.
I'd love to see that, and that's something I've been. And I was annoyingly, I did have this conversation with Sean Cooper, who's the guy who wrote Syndicate and Magic Carpet with me, and was actually one of the guys who did that data disc that I mentioned that we did in 5 days when he started Bullfrog when he was 17. We were working on a game that was sort of Populous-y, but it had like an animated it had a water simulation, and it didn't have working erosion, but it had working irrigation and stuff. And I wanted to make it as simple as Populous, but on that level, on that thing. And we sort of diverged on that, and we almost had it signed just before lockdown, but it's all kind of fizzled out into something into. He's got other commitments, another bit, him and his wife's business sort of, and that's all irrelevant, but it doesn't seem like it's exactly likely to happen. Back in February, it was almost signed, but it wasn't the game that I wanted. It evolved into something else. So,
I totally agree with you, because and when you mentioned the in pre-show sort of the Topia sort of relationship and kind of like we don't have to get into the details of that, but I think you having worked on Topia and being sort of one of the people behind that, I can totally see, especially I think mobile and iOS or something like that, because there's some really good. Not obviously the same genre per se, but I'll give some examples as a comparison. There's some really good iOS games that are taking the civilization concept but making it quicker and more arcadey, if you will, on on
I should
mobile.
be looking at more of these things.
And I think Populous is perfect. I think Populous 1, when I'm speaking to you specifically, Populous 1 is perfect for that. I totally agree with your instinct on that. I hope you can rekindle some of that or do it again someday, because I do think we both talked about, as you heard us probably, there is some core magic in Populous that I just hadn't anticipated being what it is, and doing a modern version that kind of takes all the learnings that we've had over the 30 years or what have you, that it's just, I think it would totally work. And it's great popcorn kind of feel, just seeing the little engine going, and just clicking and just having it kind of all the automated portion of it. And I totally agree with you on Black and White. It's completely two different directions. Yeah. So that's
good.
I
mean, all of the thing, everything that's sort of descended from it always just seems to have got slower and more laborious and more confusing. And I just
complicated more. Yeah. There's a lot more going on. Yeah.
And actually, I can't stop this. As you mentioned Topia, and you've also played Populous at the beginning, and you probably noticed that both of those games are set on a sphere. Yeah. What can you make? Do you? They use the same trick to fake a sphere. I mean, I don't know if you how obvious this is, because you're both programmers. So you're either going to go, oh, well, that's.
I'm not a programmer, just so you know.
Yeah, he's not a programmer.
But, it is not a sphere in Populous at the beginning. It was a guy called it was Alan Wright's idea. He was the guy that did that game, that ran that game, and then I stole it, crediting him for it from for Topia. But basically, it's a wrapping world, rather like Magic Carpet, just a square wrapping world warped through like a fisheye lens that makes it feel like a sphere, but it isn't a sphere at all. Neither Topia, both Topia and Populous Beginning do that, and it's a really sneaky. And also the game that I was working on with Sean for doing that, it's a really sneaky trick because it feels like a sphere, and it means that it means you're still working in squares and a nice map grid.
And it's brilliant.
And it wraps. It can wrap around, so you can even get rid of. You can even that's more optimal than having borders on it. But it's still a square as far as editing is concerned. It's hidden really well. Yeah, it worked really well.
That's brilliant. Yeah, really well I didn't even notice. Yeah. And in the beginning, Populous the beginning, I don't know if you listened to that episode or not, but
yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we both were sort of disappointed in. I was surprised because Brett had played it, but I hadn't played the beginning before, and so I was just surprised at how much of a diversion it was away from the original. We didn't play 2, of course, but I assume 2 is much like 1. Because it became so much more discrete level design, and sort of and more campaign focused, and I would say kind of almost less simulation based, especially on the terrain. So that's why I think Topia is such an interesting example of a counter to that. And there's been really nothing in Populous wise since. So, yeah.
Well, when that was being developed, I didn't really work on it. I was involved with the text generation system for it. That was an interesting, wacky idea that was way too ahead of its time, and is pretty much used similarly in Topia, but in Topia it's done in the shader rather than while generating the texture. But that was anyway. I'll forget that. No one who was involved with Populous was involved. The gameplay side of it was involved with Populous at the beginning, and there was a guy, Alex Trowers, who he didn't work on Populous, but he worked on everything after that. At Bullfrog as a designer, he was basically the second designer after Peter, which means that nobody knows his name because all Bullfrog games are designed by Bullfrog on them. Me and him were the two most old serving people that were there when Populous at the beginning was being done. And Alex's take on Populous is it's not Populous. It's like an RTS. It's like playing Command and Conquer, but the only unit you've got with any weapons is the Harvester.
Right.
It's
a very wacky.
I mean, we didn't like it. It had a very clever network code, though, which is why it's still being played now. It was a massive upgrade in network code. It has the same network tech as Dungeon Keeper 2. Both of those games were the first games that would work outside of LAN because we never upgraded the theory behind our network tech between Populous 1 and Dungeon Keeper. It was only so Populous at the beginning and Dungeon Keeper 2 have at least they have the ability to actually still be played online now. And the weird thing about Populous is, I think Populous at the beginning is not that great. Although I do like the sphere text, which is why I sort of stole it. And but if you look at people remembering Populous, it's the only one they really remember. You don't really find, well, you guys are around 10 years ago when you were looking for Populous, people weren't talking about the old games. It's only because retro gaming has become more of a thing, I think, that anyone's interested at all. Because it was quite disheartening 20 years ago, because it seemed like the only Populous that anyone knew was the beginning, which I didn't. No, I didn't even regard as a Populous game.
Right. No, and I can see it's definitely a weird one, because it doesn't feel like there's certain aspects of the franchise that were retained, but it doesn't really feel. And as you heard us talk about, the reason we wanted to play Populous was because of the genre, right? And part of the point of the podcast in kind of an academic way is to go back and see where these genres really originated, and they're Populous as a passive / indirect control kind of simulation game. There's lots of ones that have spawned from that genre since then. It's just, as for probably all the weird business reasons that this stuff happens, this particular franchise didn't continue, even though it really generated an entire genre. And that's probably all in EA business land or something. But yeah, anyway, so thank you so much for being on, Glenn. This was amazing. Some of the great stories and revelations.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Very rude. One last thing to do with Peter's recollections of this and my not anyone's recollections of this. The thing about Populous, a lot of your listening to your podcast as you're trying to work out why things were done this way, and I've probably cleared up that a lot of it was blind luck or just ridiculous bits of oblique intuition. But to my mind, I like to think of Populous. This is massively overstating its importance, massively. I think of it as rather like Rubik's Cube. I didn't know because when Erno Rubik made the cube that sort of where the corners can rotate, he didn't realize he was making this amazing puzzle. He was just making this thing that held together in a spooky, cool way. And then later on, he put some stickers on it and found out that he'd made possibly the best logic puzzle of all time. And not Populous as that. But at some level, I feel like Populous was like a piece of luck. It basically, the thing which I knocked up, which I made, had this weird flatlanders currency property, which Peter then turned into a game. And it's so I kind of in my more arrogant moments, I like to think of myself as the guy who invented the cube, and Peter is the guy who put the stickers on. So.
Oh, that is the quote right there.
That's it.
That's the one you'll see on Twitter next Wednesday.
Yeah.
Oh,
I have to say that at some point. I've said it before, but I've never said it.
That's very good. And I think our audience probably has not heard that one, so I certainly had. That's an excellent. That's good.
That's great. That's great. Yeah,
it's really important. Rubik's Cube would be nothing without the stickers. It wouldn't be.
But it takes both, right? It takes both aspects to really, to make that magic. And there's, of course, there's luck in there too. But I think. And I think you're being humbled to some degree as far as like its influence. But as you heard us talk about in the series, the concept at that time in '89 of getting a game like this and having terrain manipulation in this way, that's why it hit 1 million units or what have you. I mean, it's just crazy that this was a thing at that point. And it's even the anecdote that it started as on a joystick is even funnier to me now, because it's kind of we sort of speculated about what it would be like to use it in a different interface. But I think that there wasn't anything really like that other than some of the other things that were maybe procedural or something like that. But combining them, maybe him putting the stickers on by saying it should be mouse based or something is an example.
No, I mean, he wrote the game. The stickers. Were the game.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well,
and he had a unique outlook on that stuff, and I don't think there was anybody else around at the time who could have done that. I don't think there's and it was just the luck of him starting off from the thing which happened, and that feels to me like it sort of just fell out of the nowhere. Because it came from me trying to work out how I would write this Marble Madness clone, that, from a previous generation. And I didn't even solve the problems that the 8-bit versions of that game did, because that 8-bit version was all partial updates and done very, it was very clever, much cleverer than the brute force of the Populous engine. So I didn't even do what I set out to do, but
the other anecdote that I love is that you said early on the reason that you created the train manipulation part of it was because you didn't want to write a level editor. It's like, well, I don't want to write a level editor. I'm just make it something you can do on the fly. And it's like, that's hilarious. And that became the game, so it's... Yeah,
and exactly. Honestly, it was all done in 3 days, that first bit. And, I had no idea what it was going to be for. And I didn't think that the editing would be part of the game. I thought the editing was a slipshod editor at the time, but the fact that it became the game, it's so much, much luck and weirdness involved, which is kind of why I sort of resent the fact that Peter has a tendency to present it as because there's bits
a revelation.
GDC post-mortem where he talks about when he designed something that I know fell out of nothing in those first 3 days. But I don't think I'm not accusing him of lying because it's a long time ago, and it's like and I'm not 100% sure that everything I've said has been completely right, although I'm pretty sure a lot of it's very vivid to me because
Yeah. No, I get it. I mean, I think a lot. Not that I'm asking you to, but if one were to listen to a lot of our interviews where we go back, like for instance, we played the original XCOM, right? And you hear early stories about people talking about some of these classic games, and there is a lot of luck and sort of like the right people being at the right place at the right time and coming up with these conclusions. Still brilliant ideas, brilliant minds, but there is just the synergy of that stuff coming together is always kind of cool to hear, because it often isn't the plan, it just was what happened.
Serendipity.
The magic of it. So well, again, thank you, Glenn. This has been a delight having you on, and it's fun. We weren't sure we were going to be able to get a guest on for this one, so I'm glad Wayne got us together. So thanks again.
That was only like 4 days ago or something. But
we moved quick. We moved quick.
Came together very quickly.
That was great. I'm glad that it happened.
I saw that you had these interview things and thought, oh, unless they're going to come back to it later, I'm going to have to do this now anyway if they're interested. So that was part of why because my normal approach would be to get a message like that from Wayne and just ignore it until it was too late to do anything with.
Well, we appreciate you not ignoring it. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
My ego is such that when I hear that two proper game developers have been talking about my game for 3 hours, I have to listen.
Well, that's very kind of you to listen. I appreciate it, and it made for a better episode for this episode that you had listened and were thinking about it so much. Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks.
Welcome back from the break. That was quite something.
Yeah, it was awesome.
I'm glad to have a programmer on now and again. For me, like the thing where he's like, of course you could like really elevate the land, so it actually does take up all that space. I was like, hadn't considered that.
Yeah, right.
And the thing with the multiple bars and each of them being, 1 to 16 or 0 to 15 or however you want to view that was also pretty great. So pretty wild stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's it was fun to hear fall down rabbit holes on certain topics from a programmatic standpoint, and kind of just like start unraveling certain explanations like the bars themselves, or sort of like the I don't know, not rendering, but sort of how he was problem solving the the land manipulation part of it early on, and I think just still, as I mentioned while he was on, that it's still hilarious to me, the motivation for the land manipulation, and for him not wanting to create an editor,
not wanting to make the editor,
wanting to do it real time. So I was like, and it's like that's the perfect example of a gem of a moment where gameplay is coming from a very unexpected place, like revolutionary gameplay, because someone didn't want to, go through the work.
Fundamentally, a lot of game innovation comes from programmer laziness, I would say.
Well, laziness maybe is one way to say it, but I know you're joking, but also there's just the problem solving of like, how would I do this in a much more elegant or like clever way than just, making an editor for it, so that's just hilarious to me.
And the multiplayer working by just writing a file as well. So,
right.
So
yeah.
Good.
That's funny. Yeah. And
early stuff. Yeah.
No campaign until 2 weeks to ship. I feel like there was there was a similar, wasn't there a similar story when we did XCOM with,
they put in the difficulty basically 2 days before they shipped or something like that. I don't remember the exact timing, right. But he put in the weird rubber banding.
Yes, that's right.
Of difficulty, basically. Well, anyway, this will probably make it, work.
Right.
Basically, not enough time to even test that. Although they did claim that this game got played like all 500 levels, and it's funny that they had one that was the agreed upon most difficult, somewhere in the 350s or whatever.
Yeah.
It was. Like not even at the end.
Right.
So also good.
Hilarious.
They could have just moved that one to the end. Anyway. It's just a list of numbers, as he pointed out. Very good. Very, very good stuff. I love it.
I'm glad we got Glenn on. Yeah, it was definitely like right in under the wire. So, and I want to thank Wayne Frost as well, who was our contact there and hooked us up with Glenn. So,
thanks to the both of them. Thanks for Glenn making the time in such short order, as you point out. Yeah, very, very good. I mean that. Yeah, it was like 3 days, I think. We were like, we might have an interview, and then it happened 3 days later. So very good.
As a quick anecdote, too, I wanted to mention, I was actually talking to Wayne today, and he worked on the beginning. And he's listened to that episode, and he wanted to add in, and I think it's very clear, because he said we kind of nailed a lot of sort of like the difficulties and assumptions and where it came from and sort of like how, and the struggles, and sort of how they were coming about what to do with that, franchise essentially at that era. And he said, it was just funny because he confirmed the fact that they sort of like, there was sort of they were heretics when it came to what they were, like the people's, there were definitely the camps on the team that were like, you can't make a Populous game without, terrain manipulation, and he said they actually had, obviously you would assume they would have prototypes where you were manipulating the 3D geometry. But they said it was just so powerful with the way that they were, that the game was just completely different. So they went with, what they did. But he said, everyone thought that they were heretics for making the game that way. So
I can believe it. It's like moving jump away from the A button. So
there you go. That's our own little version of that. Yes.
Yeah. Much. But I can totally imagine that would be very difficult for an RTS. Still, I love the idea of a more arcadey version of this game, even more so. Because it's something we talked about, and for Glenn to be like, I think there might be something there. Also fun. So
yeah, totally. Didn't even occur to me.
Great conversation, and a lot of fun. So anyway, it's come down to, this is coming out on the very last day of September, which means it's time for our annual Halloween October game. Get into the seasonal spirit with something a little bit more creepy. And so we are doing, we are kind of dipping our toe into something that we're both maybe a little concerned about for a number of reasons. for me, it's more just a question of length and like how well we'll be able to center it, because it feels like this is a game with a huge amount of choice. But that might make for some interesting discussion. We're going to dive into 2004's Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, a cult classic. I think it's easy to describe as not a huge success at the time, but it has managed to have its followers throughout the last decade and a half or whatever since it came out. I think this might be a 5-weeker. We'll see. Certainly with interviews, I think we'll be able to get 1 or 2 interviews, and that would certainly push it over. But even the play may take us into November, which would take us right up to when it launched. So we might be interviewing people on a anniversary or something like that, which will be fun. It's a big sprawling game, is my understanding. I don't even know how far to tell us to play, but we should certainly do character creation in the tutorial. And then we should delve a little bit into Santa Monica, which is the first chapter. And I think that after having some of that under our belt, some of the quest stuff that's in Santa Monica, we'll have a better sense of like how much each chapter is. I don't think we need to try to finish Santa Monica this time out, because we'll have a lot to talk about just to set it in its time and talk about its engine, and which is something we sort of talked about in the past, because it uses the source engine. So it'd be really interesting to delve into that. But also, like, I picked a whatever clan, you picked a whatever clan. Now our game is totally different. Right. I understand things like that may really kind of push us all over the place. I'm really, like, part of me wants to be playing it multiple characters at once to see that, but I don't think that's sustainable for my life. I wouldn't recommend it, but
you've been known to do crazier things, so
I have indeed. Although I don't know that I can do it with my elbows the way they've been the past couple of months. So
another connection that I didn't think of when we were talking about this in pre-show is Leonard Boyarsky. That's his name, right?
Yes, okay. Boyarsky.
So we had him on. He and Tim Kaine on to interview them for Fallout 1. He's one of the directors on this game. But also he and Tim have most recently, along with the others I think that worked on this game, shipped the Outer Worlds.
Correct. Yep.
So and I think that there's probably some similarities and correlations to their sorts the genre, if you will, or the types of narrative and things. So there's a couple different angles on playing vampire right now, I think that are meaningful and relevant for today. So
yeah, no, that's an interesting point for sure. I mean, that's something that they mentioned to us. We didn't know what the give was, but that they were working together on something when they went to, I guess that was Obsidian, right? Before they were purchased. I mean, they're still Obsidian, I suppose.
Yep.
But now they're part of Microsoft. So yeah, that'll be interesting to talk about. It'll also be interesting to talk about a sort of big RPG after one of my own former employers was recently acquired by Microsoft, and a big deal. Anyway, big news. So we'll dive into that. Tim and I will touch base while we're playing to see how far we get in Santa Monica. But I do think that's at least what we want to kind of aim to do, is get our feet wet, get a feel for our new powers as vampires. Maybe you might say sink our teeth in to the beginning of the game, and then look to fully drain it later.
Oh boy!
Anyway,
wow, it's going to be
look forward to this month, folks.
It's going to be
it's gonna depending on your point of view, it might bite. Anyway.
5 to 8 weeks of this. Great. Can't wait.
This is entirely why I wanted to play this game, Tim, is just for the punning. So,
great. Can't wait.
Meanwhile, in our D&D campaign, you're also dealing with a vampire. You're going to be getting it from me far too many hours a week.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that
so
darn vampire.
Look forward to more of that next week. Of course, we love to have reviews. I wanted to mention here, because I didn't hear on Twitter, someone sent us a review, but it looked like all of the text part of it was a singing review even, so it looks like all of the lyrics were cut off. Also, it was a very challenging tune for me to set it to. I believe the name of the reviewer was Aw Yeah. So, Aw Yeah, if you're out there, you need to send that in to our email address, which is devgameclub@gmail.com.
Well, unfortunately, you can't spell Tim Longo out of Aw Yeah. Otherwise, I would have claimed.
Yeah, he claimed to have done that. Yeah, no, it's definitely not a possibility. I thought about it for a brief moment. No, I did not think about it. Anyway, you can find us on the web at devgameclub.com and on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton and commissioned by friend of the cast, Aaron Evers. Have fun sinking your teeth in this week, and good night.
Good night.